Hey guys, Nick Espinosa, your chief security fanatic here. And today I'm talking about tech companies and should they be forced to keep user data that they collect in the user's own country. Now, here's what's going on that sparks this conversation. At the end of January, Russia's telecommunications watchdog, Roskomnadzor, which I believe I am pronouncing correctly, instituted administrative proceedings against Facebook and Twitter after both of those companies refused to store data on Russian users within Russia itself. Yesterday, a court in Moscow fined Twitter and Facebook 4 million rubles, or roughly $63,000 US each, for basically failing to comply with this because Russian citizen data is not being stored in Russia. This is the largest fine, according to Russian media, that the Kremlin has ever imposed on a tech platform or IT firm outside of Russia since they created this law in 2012. But this is not the first time Russia has actually done this. In 2016, they actually blocked LinkedIn because of this same legislation. And so LinkedIn, for the most part, is verboten, pardon the German, in Russia. Now, here are my thoughts on this right now, because Russia is considering banning tech companies that don't comply with this law. And by virtue of that, they may be shutting themselves off from the Facebooks, Twitters, LinkedIn's, etc. of the world, not to mention other platforms, possibly Amazon, etc. if Amazon is not complying. And that leads us to a couple of different issues, thoughts, and questions. And the first one that I was thinking about is that basically platforms like Facebook and Twitter, which are the centerpiece of this thing in Russia right now, are literally between a rock and a hard place. They are worried about illegal access to their data in countries where the government basically gives them very little control and dictates how they should be maintaining that data within the infrastructure of the country. Russia is very authoritarian compared to many Western countries, and by virtue of that, the Russian government would want to get their hooks into this information, primarily to monitor their citizens. Russia's not the only one that wants to do this. China's the same way, Vietnam, and on and on and on. The next point that I want to talk about is data privacy laws, or lack thereof in many cases, vary from government to government. And so what that means is that governments basically will demand little to no transparency from these platforms, leaving users in the dark. Now, we know that we are spinning up transparency laws in the European Union with GDPR. The United States here is starting to get these kinds of privacy laws. California leading the way with CCPA. There are other transparency laws in other countries like Canada, Australia, etc. But there's a lot of countries out there that basically don't want to give their users that level of transparency because they want to get their hooks into the data and watch this. And if they are giving their users the ability to, let's say, be erased from a system, that may interrupt the government's ability to data mine them in an authoritarian manner. So I think that is something that needs to be under consideration. The next thing that we need to talk about is the potential cost of actually doing this. If every single country on the planet had this law and said, if you are going to be in everywhere from Russia to China to Fiji, and that information needs to be stored in the country on that Fijian citizen or that Russian or that Canadian or whoever that is, that can get very cost prohibitive for a Facebook or a Twitter. Granted, these companies make an absolute ton of money, but the operating expenses of creating that massive of an infrastructure or renting or leasing, from another massive infrastructure can be very, very costly, especially as it starts to consume bandwidth and space. And so that's something that we really have to look at into this consideration. Now, this isn't going away. This problem has actually been, I think, festering and growing for years. So, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that which was being created under former President Obama, which was eventually killed by now President Trump, was doing a lot of different things for trade along the Pacific Rim. But one of those things that a lot of people, myself included, had an issue with TPP, was that it would allow a Facebook, for example, to start storing data on U.S. citizens in Chinese data centers, which would be a massive cost savings to a Facebook. But by virtue of that government being very authoritarian and liking to data mine and learn all of this kind of stuff, that is abhorrent to somebody that lives in a country where we have specific rights under our law to privacy, and transparency. European Union obviously stepping it up, as I mentioned before. And so by virtue of that, there were a lot of privacy advocates that had serious issues with that provision of TPP, excuse me. I am not talking about the whole holistic TPP, whether you love it or hate it. I'm talking about that one specific thing. And if you have any semblance of an idea of privacy in your life, you probably hate it too. And so that leads me to another thought. And I think this is interesting. And I'd love to hear your opinion on this if you want to share it with me. And I welcome all opinions, even if it's to tell me that I'm an idiot. But do we need to create some kind of jointly administered autonomous zone in the world that basically we can then store data into, that basically enforces that level of transparency for the countries that are basically actively participating in this autonomous zone? By virtue of this, we can then set aside an entire, let's say, block of space, like an embassy in a foreign country. So, for example, as a United States citizen, if I'm in Australia and I walk into the U.S. Embassy, even though I'm on the continent of Australia, I am technically on United States soil because I am in a U.S. embassy, and it works for embassies all over the world in the same way. This is a system that is essentially universally agreed to, and so can we have some kind of data embassy in that manner that would allow countries to basically say, well, we're not going to house this data, on ourselves, but we now can store it in a place where certain rules and laws for all citizens, whatever country, are guaranteed. Obviously, Russia and China and some other countries that are authoritarian and don't want that transparency would have a serious issue with it. But as we continue to grow, as we continue to expand our population, both just by human population standards and by internet population standards, it's something that I think we should probably consider. I just have no idea if we'd be able to get it off the ground. We can barely get countries to agree, even when we have bodies like the United Nations, which I understand are non-binding, but the whole point there is to get together and talk it out. So I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that. But as we are developing the internet, and I've written articles for Forbes on this regarding the bifurcation of the internet coming around 2028, when the Chinese are going to basically, through their Belt and Road Initiative, spin up an intranet among 60 to 70 odd countries or more, where they administer the internet for these smaller countries through economic development. Are we walking into something like this? Do we need to be universally guaranteeing rights? And if so, how do we do that? Is it an autonomous zone? Is it something through the UN? Is it something entirely different? I'd love to hear your thoughts, because quite frankly, this situation is only going to get worse, and it's only going to get more burdensome, not just for the tech companies, but also for the users, many of whom may be sitting in Russia thinking, I don't want my data it being stored in Russia, because then the Russian government sees more actively what I am doing with myself, and I don't necessarily want that. I think that's a human right. You may disagree. Feel free. That is your news of the day, and I found that interesting. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, and please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. Thanks, guys.